I'd like to play a clip from a previous guest on our show, Dan Barker, a former Christian evangelical pastor who's now an atheist, an author of Losing Faith in Faith. And since you're an expert in talking to folks like this, and you weren't around when Dan was on our show, I wondered if you would just respond to something that he said.
All right, I'll try.
And which category do you find yourself in, hard or soft?
In both. Regarding the general question, I am a lowercase a atheist because I haven't done my homework and looked at every one of the 6 million definitions of God and disproved each one, and no one has.
Right.
So, I'm open. Maybe one of those is right, and maybe it isn't. But at this point, I can't say for certain that all of them don't exist. But if you ask me about the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, that God does not exist. That God is not only illogical, but actually, even if he did exist, would not be worthy of our worship.
So we're talking with Bill Craig, author of God, Time, and Eternity. Bill, can anyone reasonably claim that they know for certain that the God of the Bible does not exist?
Well, I don't think that you can make that claim justifiably, though I think that if you could show, for example, as I think Dan would hold, that there's a logical contradiction in the biblical concept of God, that would be a proof that God does not exist. Mm-hmm. For example, if you could show that God had contradictory attributes, so that he was like a round triangle or a married bachelor, then God could not exist because a logical contradiction cannot be true. So if somebody could show that the concept of God is logically incoherent, then I think that would be a successful disproof of God. But I don't, in fact, think that anybody has succeeded in showing such a thing.
Bill, a follow-up question on that. When you get outside of time and space, though, is it impossible to have a round triangle or a married bachelor? Aren't the rules all different out there? This is a side point. This isn't really where we're going, but I've had this discussion with others in the past, and I'd love to hear a comment from someone of your credentials.
No, I don't think so. There's nothing about being a married bachelor that has anything to do with time and space. There's no reason to think that in a timeless state or a spaceless state that a logical contradiction can be true. The definition of a bachelor is an unmarried male. So to say that there's a married bachelor is to say there's a married, unmarried male, and that's just logical nonsense. That's simply a contradiction in terms.
Well, Sam Harris throws out one of those, what he thinks is a logical contradiction. Sam Harris is a former guest on our show, a New York Times best-selling author. Bill, I know you're familiar with his work. He was invited, along with Rick Warren, to discuss the issue of is God real in this past Easter edition of Newsweek magazine. And this is one of those places where Harris pointed, I think, or tried to point to one of those logical contradictions where he said there are, how can God be a God worth worshiping? The same point that Dan Barker raised when he said there are sections of the Bible which are sheer barbarism, yet profess to describe a divinely mandated morality. That's the seeming inherent contradiction. He goes on to say, books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Exodus and 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Samuel, half the kings and prophets of Israel would be taken to The Hague and prosecuted for crimes against humanity if those events took place in our own time. So is that one of those inherent contradictions about God?
No, I don't think that would be a successful argument, even if it went through. Think about what this argument proves, even if successful. Assuming that all of its premises are true, what would it prove? It wouldn't prove that God doesn't exist. What it would prove is that the Bible is not an accurate record of what God is like, that the ancient Israelites, in writing these narratives, got it wrong about God. So what that would force someone to do would be to abandon the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, and that might cause him to have to adjust his doctrine of inspiration so that although God exists, the inspired by God isn't necessarily inerrant in everything it says about God, but it wouldn't disprove that God exists. So it's very important when we weigh these kind of arguments that we see exactly what they target, and an argument like this is really an argument against biblical inerrancy. It's not an argument against the existence of God.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you were in if you were in a discussion, a nice friendly discussion over a club soda with Sam Harris, and he raised that, how would you respond?
Well, in a couple of ways. Given that my interest would be in trying to win Sam Harris to Christ, to try to invite him to become a believer, I wouldn't try to convince him that the Bible is inerrant. I would say, Sam, at best your argument shows that the Bible isn't inerrant. But you don't have to believe in biblical inerrancy in order to be a Christian. God can exist. Jesus Christ can be his son. Jesus can be risen from the dead and have died for your sin without these Old Testament stories being an accurate portrayal of what God wanted to happen. And therefore, these aren't really an obstacle to you coming to Christ. That's what I would try to do. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe myself that these narratives are accurate and inspired, but I want to lower the bar as much as I could to invite him to become a Christian without even a belief in biblical inerrancy, rather than to try to make belief in biblical inerrancy a precondition to his becoming a Christian.
Mm-hmm. Can you give just one example of the way that you, for yourself, harmonized that account of the aggressive wiping out of populations by the God of the Bible with your own belief in the Bible?
Yeah, this is what I would say. I would say that God is not bound by the same moral duties that we are. Our moral duties are established by God's commandments to us, that it is in virtue of being commanded to do this or that we have certain moral obligations or duties. But God himself doesn't issue commands to himself, so he doesn't stand under the same moral duties that we do. So, for example, it would be wrong if I were to whip out a gun and shoot someone for no reason at all. Mm-hmm. That would be against my moral duty. It would be wrong. But if God wants to strike me dead right now, that's his prerogative. God is the author and giver of life, and he has the prerogative to give and take life as he sees fit. So he's not bound by the same moral duties that I am. Now, when God commands the Israelites to exterminate the Canaanite clans, they are acting as God's moral agents under his command. And so I think that God had the right to command them to do something which, in the absence of a divine command, would have been wrong. But given a divine command, it is not wrong. In fact, it becomes their moral duty. Moreover, God had good reasons for giving this command. He had waited 400 years while the Israelites were slaves in Egypt until the Canaanite nation was so wicked and so debauched that it was ripe for divine judgment. And so he used the armies of Israel as an instrument of his judgment upon these clans in Canaan, knowing that ultimately their extermination would be better for Israel in the long run. They wouldn't be contaminated by their influences, that these persons were deserving of judgment, and in the case of innocent people who might have been killed, that even in their case, God has the right to give and take life as he sees fit. And so he's under no obligation to prolong their lives or to extend them, so that these Israelite armies were acting as the instrument of God to carry out his will and to do something which, in the absence of that command, they wouldn't have had the right or authority to do.
Mm-hmm. I find it interesting that in today's culture, we're quite willing for outside peacekeepers to go into Darfur or Rwanda when they see so many innocent lives being taken. You know, somebody has to do something about this. And yet, when the God of the Old Testament sends the Israelites in to take care of a nation who is sacrificing their innocent children in the fire to one of their gods, you know, that somehow that deserves a pass. And I appreciate your response.
These were really very morally degenerate tribes, these Canaanite clans, that deserved to be judged. I think the hardest thing to understand is how God could command that even the children of the Canaanites be slaughtered.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why I say God isn't under moral compulsion to prolong anybody's life. If he wants to strike my son or daughter dead, that's his prerogative, and no moral complaint can be raised about that because God isn't under any moral duty to prolong their life. And so he has the right to take the lives of the Canaanite children or to prolong them as he sees fit. And if he uses the Israeli armies as his instrument by which he does that, then it seems to me he's perfectly within his rights to do that.
And from God's perspective, if he welcomes the innocent children into a life with him, he may save them from a much worse fate if they grew up in their culture and fell under his judgment.
The children, by being killed, are really, in one sense, better off if we believe children go to heaven, as I do, than they would be allowing to live on in the circumstances in which they were.